China, who is also not a local Chinese. And we basically both came out of like photo film production side, and were suddenly confronted with this 3D emerging, let's say, pivot that happened in the industry, where everybody was suddenly not taking photos anymore of cars and industrial products, but rather rendered it. So we just built that new company, which was during that time exploding quite fast. It was like around 2010. Suddenly, lots of employees were onboarded. So we in 2010 we grew from 2 to 15 people, and then in 2011 we added motion picture as well, and then we went from 15 to about 25 people. And during that time, it was interesting because I had built we were originally coming from a photo studio, so we had like a large scale photo studio for car productions, physical space on site in an ex-airport hangar.
Hey Martin, I think I can switch off my. You can keep your video. I can switch off mine so I could like save a little bit of bandwidth, because I think this might make the connection better. So you can just keep the video, and I think that's going to save bandwidth a little bit.
Sure. So we had this originally emerging out of a photo studio surroundings in the middle of Shanghai, and then we figured out like, okay, the world is going towards 3D here, and that happened basically 5 years earlier. So 5 years earlier, I started to actually develop the idea of a tech pipeline for 3D within our photo studio. And by that time, I was basically, that was the first time for me, like looking for help in the internet, basically, because 2005, roughly, 2005, 2006. And I found actually really cool 3D models online. So then I've like 3D models of cars that were looking like totally realistic. And I wanted to render them, and then I bought them off the guy who made them. And then I started to have a little email conversation with that guy. And he was like really helpful, and I had basically no clue. I was a photographer during that time and needed to learn 3D. So I asked him like, hey, can I pay you a little bit and you become my tutor and teach me like how all this 3D stuff kind of works. Do you still hear me? Do you still hear me? Not sure. Maybe connection broke. Let me see on which Wi-Fi I am. I'm on the right one.
We disconnected, and I think I switched the network, so hopefully it works a little bit better.
Okay, good. I hear you again now.
Yeah.
Good. Nice. So, all right. So we were at the point that I found basically.
Yeah, I think I lost you after, like you said, like in 2005, 2006, you were searching for 3D models of cars online, and then you had interest in tech components of integrating technology into that, and then in 2011, 2012, then business in China started to pick up and to consider digital like car modeling. So that's when it was booming, and you were onboarding almost like 10 employees every year.
Right. So the interesting thing there was that, or the story that I'm just trying to phrase is like how I got into remote work in the first place, which was due to the fact that I was in China. And China, by that time, 2005, 2006-ish, when we wanted to do 3D, was not a very big market for that. There were not many people doing stuff. There were a little bit going on in architecture rendering, but that's it. And that's very different to what we had to do in mind with cars. So I bought these car models of one guy in Czech Republic, basically a guy who was like selling 3D models in the internet, and then I got into a conversation with him, and over time we actually kind of like became like online friends, and he started training me on 3D, and I started paying him like, hey, can you teach me all that? And that was basically the first contact. And about a year later, when we really started to making a department out of this in our company in Shanghai, then I actually hired that guy. So that was my first remote worker. Then in 2006, as in 2006, I hired basically somebody from Czech Republic that I had never met in my life, but that I was already kind of like working remotely, kind of like with for like a year, and very quickly that guy became basically the head of department in our case. So we started then later in after 2010, we started to also edit local talent in China. But that guy from Czech Republic, his name is David, he stayed the head of the 3D department of the entire company. And he basically...
Yeah, and question here, Martin. Yeah, did he continue to work remotely after being hired, or he had to come to Shanghai to...
No, he
so did he move, or he continued to work remotely?
Exactly.
Ah,
so
okay.
it was a very interesting experiment, because especially the Great Firewall of China gave us a bit of hard time to live through that distance. But we always managed well, and we actually created render capacities on both sides. So we had some capacities in Czech Republic, not too much. The main capacities on rendering, like we had 40 plus rendering machines basically in a server room then in China, in Shanghai. And he completely managed everything online. So that was really interesting. The first time we actually met was in 2012, where the production then by that time went so big that we actually asked him to, like, David, please, can you come to China and live here?
Yeah.
And then he moved to China for like 3 months or 4, but he didn't like it, and then he moved back to to Czech Republic, and he kept living there ever since. So that was my first point with remote work, and based on that, we actually were kind of like thinking, hey, if I have my head of department in another country, while everybody else in this department kind of like works here in Shanghai locally, then, how come we also, we go and we add on more employees also from overseas and see if we can widen a more, let's say, freelance workforce. However, in Shanghai, that didn't really work out. We tried a lot with international freelancers, but it seemed to always be a little bit the problem that maybe it was the culture that either these people brought into or brought with them, or it was also a little bit the culture that was in our company, because everybody that we employed in the 3D department in our company came after David. So David was there in the first place, and he was remote. And then everybody who we employed were kind of like on the same page, like, okay, my direct boss here is kind of not in the country, which was totally cool with everybody. But then if you suddenly had a coworker that was not in the country, then that actually gave problems, because that was then a new thing that was introduced, and you had to kind of like had a different way of communication style with that, and everybody in the office was pretty much working on a I communicate with you over the desk kind of basis. And then suddenly there was like this one guy in the crew who was also in the team, but had to be communicated online. And by that time, that was then 2012, 13ish, and there were not many tools by that day that actually empower you for remote work too well, other than email, and then it started a little bit that things like Slack or something came up. However, at some point, this kind of like I call it restrained office work, because we had an office that had about 250 square meter in the middle of Shanghai, and that was the space. So I couldn't actually add more people. In the end, we were like around 30 people in the company, and I just couldn't add more people because space was simply not enough. Even if we were freelancers, I couldn't bring them into our physical office. So that was really brought me to these boundaries of like, hey, point one, I want to scale more. Point two, I'm also working here in this environment, like film productions is an environment where you need like 30, 40, 50 people to make one movie. But then the movie is finished like a month later, and then you don't need any of them anymore. And it's like a seasonal work, and it's also difficult to run the company with that type of overhead if you have to maybe account for like a month or two where maybe you don't have a client. So all of that kind of like made me thinking, and when I then moved the company over to Europe in 2014-15, I restructured everything completely, and literally went into a full remote company. So there were no employees anymore. Actually, David, the guy that, from 2005 already history, he became partner in the new company. So we founded in Czech Republic and in Berlin. But this company has basically no employees. So everybody in the company works on remote and freelance base. So this company doesn't even have an office, a physical space. Instead of that, I started setting up a software-based solution where then we would create those movies that we were making before, all online, throughout different time zones, throughout different culture groups, and so on.
If I may ask here, Martin, you said like there are no employees. Does this mean like what kind of contracts did you have with the with the working staff? So they were like freelancer, they like get paid per project, or there's some kind of
yes, we have project-based project-based working contracts. So we get a project, let's say in a movie for a client. Then we know, okay, that thing is gonna take, I don't know, 3 months. Then we hire that person for 3 months. Or another way is that we are actually putting the teams together according to the scenes that we have in the movie. Like, let's say, for example, you have, 5 scenes with a car, then you need, 2 or 3 specialists for cars, and then you have like 2 scenes where liquids and waters are involved, or where you need to do simulations of any kind. Then you get somebody for that, and then you basically pay them and hire them for that scene. And then that person would kind of like judge, like, okay, I need that amount of X for this scene. Then it's not so much time bound; it's more like goal orientated.
Yeah. So did you have to kind of invest in the onboarding of these employees to be able to work online? were they kind of used to doing remote work because they're also project based, or like there were some like cultural issues or some challenges in terms of working with them remotely and managing them remotely?
Yeah, that's of course lots of questions. So for us, the way to go into this was that I would first hire people that used to work in my company in Shanghai.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, and then those were basically then all on freelance base, and actually most of them are really lucky because we had a couple of really tough years in Shanghai, and most of them didn't have much of holidays. So what these guys did
Mm-hmm.
is they moved to Thailand, brought their
Ah,
laptop on
okay.
the beach,
Mm-hmm.
and then kept on working in our company and still were retaining their income basically, but
Mm-hmm.
and working in more or less the same environment, with according to people, but very different, let's say, technical environment.
Mm-hmm.
However, that worked pretty well, and and with the growth of the projects, then we also started to onboard new people, and these new people,
Mm-hmm.
um, they then would need to kind of like fit in.
Mm-hmm.
I see the problem with that. I don't really see in the technical or in the platform. Let's say the platform that we were using was a platform that I built together, basically in a low coding format on a system called Podio.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
Podio is a startup that was built by Citrix at some point, and yeah, they have their servers in Europe. So we had it was good for our GDPR issues there, and yeah, and it's basically a low coding platform. So somebody who is not really familiar with like writing a lot of code can still concentrate on getting something done. And for me as an entrepreneur, by that time, I didn't know much about like, okay, how can I write actual programs here? But I was totally
Mm-hmm.
able to understand my workflow in my own company. So, and that is what the
Mm-hmm.
entrepreneur is very professional about, right? Like, there's nobody who knows your own company better than you as the person who runs it.
Yes.
So, all the processes, exactly what the people do, what they don't like to do, and so on, where you need to make stuff mandatory in order for them to fill it out, where not, and so
Mm-hmm.
on. So, low coding platforms, not only Podio, but there are many now today. There are also many that are actually much better than Podio, I believe. But these low coding platforms empower people like entrepreneurs to actually, um, yeah, to actually take this next step and bring your own work flow, your own chain of production into a software based
Yeah.
solution. And
Mm-hmm.
but that, I have to say, is not really the problem. Like, okay, that might seem the problem for a lot of companies today that have to escape now for COVID reasons into online work, but or into remote work. But in fact, that's not really the problem that you're gonna have. These kind of platforms. I set up my first platform within 3 months. Now I'm setting up platforms in an afternoon. So you get really used to that.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem that you're going to have is more like keeping the company culture together. If you have a
Mm-hmm.
completely remote company, culture is really a difficult thing, because all these kind of like evenings, dinners, hey, let's go for a beer afterwards, hey, let's have a team
Yeah.
outing. You don't have that anymore. And you need to give
Mm-hmm.
some kind of space to the people to connect besides the work also somehow. And since these are all
Mm-hmm.
freelancers, most of them have kind of like arranged their time and their life um, the way how their own personal environment is, right? Like I drop my pen and I
Yeah.
go to my family, or I go to diving, or I do whatever I do, right? So you would not actually go
Mm-hmm.
and say like, hey, I've worked with you on a project, and now we finished it. Let's hang out on Zoom and have a beer
Mm-hmm.
together,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
so this is something that you basically inheritively have missing in these
Yeah.
kind of like
Mm-hmm.
full remote companies, and this is difficult to kind of like carry on. So you have to use other elements to form culture. One is, a good online etiquette, right? So that everybody is on the same page,
Mm-hmm.
that you have really nice onboarding documents, that people who work with you the first time have the feeling like, okay, here I'm being taken care of, here I can ask my questions, and so on. Because quintessentially, it's the way that if you have a remote team, then I would say, maybe that's a personal assumption, but I would say you have more frequent changes in your team than if you have a based team
Mm-hmm.
in a place. Because it's just a lot
Yeah.
easier to onboard people, and also to, not prolong with people after certain projects. Um, so that is something that's just a little bit in the nature of things. And the question for me was always like, okay, if you have all these fluctuations, how can you actually still keep this company culture and the values that you have in the company alive? And
Yeah.
yeah, and you do this. I mean, for me, I do this a lot through communication and documentation. So there's a certain amount
Mm-hmm.
of documentation that basically every employee has to go through. Not employee, it's like remote worker has to go through.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, and uh, and then based on these documents, you can already infuse a lot of culture in there, right? So that
Mm-hmm.
people can take a cultural decision in a moment of doubt without need to ask back to their superiors or to me or anybody else
Yeah.
in the management. Um, that is something that
Yeah.
has turned out to be really, really important for several reasons.
Mm-hmm.
One is, if you work through different time zones, you always have the problem that at some place you are not online, and then people can't ask you questions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and sometimes there is the case that nobody from management is online, and then what are people going to do? So in that moment, you need a strong
Mm-hmm.
company culture in order for people to make a decision based on what they think the company would do in this case. So therefore, the company needs to have a very defined culture, because the employees have to make their own decisions, and they have to kind of like know, like, okay, this is what the company would do, right? This is what my boss would do in that
Yeah.
case.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
point one.
So Martin, I have I have a question here, trying to compare that setup with what had been happening in the past months, because as we can see, like lots of companies already had like full-time contracts with employees. They have online, and then also they are like some employees are not continuing, some new employees are joining. So do you see as a general pattern we are going to be seeing less full-time employment contracts and more project-based contracts and like in the coming months and years?
Um, well, I think it really depends on in which industry you are looking at. A lot of industries that are now disrupted by startups, you will have. I see that development, because startups inheritively tend to not give permanent contracts to people. it depends a little bit also on the country and on the ecosystem that the startup is bound to. But I see a tendency going into that direction. However, this is very much a startup phenomena, I think. In most other industries, like, I don't know, for example, I don't know, real estate industry or heavy industry or machinery or, basically where the companies are just like inheritively bigger, and we are looking more into a corporate world. In this area, I don't really see short-term contracts being a big thing. It's like they mainly don't hire short-term contracts. If they do short-term contracts, then usually with consulting firms that do that for them. But they usually just hire, and they hire forever, and they usually have very strong programs also to keep their employees engaged and so on. So I don't see that part really changing. For example, now in Siemens in Germany, they have just changed the rule and kept, even throughout the summer where COVID was not so much of a thing, it's now coming back. They kept all basically white collar workers at home. So it was like throughout Siemens, which I don't know how many thousands of people they employ, but there was a company decision that we are basically supporting work from home throughout the whole complete year 2020, and they have really established that. They have programs for how can employees increase the quality of their workplace at home, where they could even buy, like, I don't know, user-friendly mices or whatever, a good new chair. So these kind of programs were all running. So obviously people who actually have to work in a factory and have to work on machinery that Siemens has on site, those people not, they have to come to work. But everybody else goes into remote work for the complete year. And they have managed that. And it works pretty well. Like the friends that I have working at Siemens, they're all quite happy with the situation.
Yeah. And like many companies also had some of these programs. So these programs were introduced just evolving. They just designed these programs, or these how existed before.
Well, the programs that I was talking about here are more non-technical programs. It's like basically like how can you support your remote workforce during COVID times, right? So that can be going towards like physical support by just making sure they have all the things they need on site, that people have laptops, that they have printers, that they, whatever. But then also goes into like well-being, so that they have, I don't know, like in our company, for example, we had like ergonomic, laptop holders and things that you could carry in the company. There's also, and then obviously also psychological programs. That's not what every company has, but big corporates, I see this happening. So they actually, give you a certain amount of, hours that you can take per, I don't know, month or week, with a psychiatrist. So that you can talk throughout your difficult time that you have now at home, especially when the kids are not in school and they're also at home, and you still have to align with your amount of work that you have to do per day. So all these kind of like mental challenges, they might be tackled. So these are programs that are, in my opinion, they are relatively easy to create and And also most of these programs, they can be outsourced or helped with by a company that you just say like, okay, can you do this for us? And then they do it.
Yes.
The other side of the metal is the technical part. So I also work as a CTO in companies, and there it usually is a lot more complicated. For example, I have been talking to employees of banks where they simply can't do homework. Um, like basically they could because they're working on laptops in the office, but they just can't leave the office because there's no infrastructure in place that secures the data um, legally over the internet into somebody's home.
Yeah.
And that is a technical problem for a lot of companies because they are running on infrastructure that was born, I don't know, in the mid 2000s or around 2010 to 12. So it's not really cloud based. It's not very easy to scale into remote work, and that is an issue. The second issue that we see there is a legal issue. This is something that I don't really see so much here in Egypt, but I see this in Germany a lot. That, for example, according to data protection law, you can have certain type of user data only inside of your company. So if somebody takes it home, even though he basically takes the company laptop home, there is already a legal gray zone where this might be a problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or printouts are also a problem. Like printouts can
Yeah.
only be held in the physical company with user data. They
Mm-hmm.
cannot be printed out at home at somebody's home. I also,
Yeah.
my sister works in the German government, in the central government, and they have a similar problem as well. They've managed to
Mm-hmm.
move most of the stuff to remote work now, and they actually
Mm-hmm.
did a pretty tremendous job. So they really set up infrastructure that is decent, I would say. But on the legal side, there are just certain things that they just simply can't do. It's impossible under the German law, especially on data protection side.
Yeah. Well, that was a lot insightful, Martin. I think how about on your own personal experience as someone who works remotely? What are the some of the personal observations and like challenges and from like working remotely and working from home as well? So combining those together, what are the challenges that you see yourself experiencing?
Mm.
And can imagine also plenty of people who suddenly have to work from home would be experiencing.
So for me, a big thing is that if you work on a remote project, um, I personally, I'm a big fan of a physical kickoff meeting, especially if
Mm-hmm.
it's a longer project. So you're working on, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know, on any kind of production that runs like half a year or 3 months or a year or whatever. I am a big fan of getting everybody together in one room,
Mm-hmm.
and work through the kickoff, basically.
Yeah.
Um, so that is something that I personally really, really like. And whenever I budget a new project, I always put this into a budget. Um,
Mm-hmm.
then throughout the project, the project runs just a lot smoother. And that comes
Mm-hmm.
mainly with this feeling that you have for the physical people in the team. Even though you work remote with them
Mm-hmm.
forever afterwards, you have met them once, you have got a personal introduction, you got your feeling about the other person, you, something clicked or not. And especially if you have like longer projects, then it's actually good to make like a kickoff event so that people really stay together, let's say also overnight, have dinner together, go out, and then, next day they go back to wherever city they come from. That usually doesn't kill the budget totally, but it makes the overall project a lot better and a lot smoother. And and those things are things that I'm looking forward in remote work. So now when we are in COVID, then in a lot of companies, this is already given. So the people already know each other. They already have worked together for very close. So they don't need to have this newly. They don't need to create this bond, but
Yeah.
they need to cope with the change that they do not have this very tight bond any longer, and now they have to work remote. So there's a different challenge
Yeah.
there. But from work efficiency side, that is something that I would always encourage in a complete remote work, that you at least like once a year you come together, you meet everybody, and then. So for me personally, for example, I have been working with our company's Cairo team for now 8 or 9 months, and we got quite close online. Actually, we have a lot of projects together. We talk a lot on a daily basis, and it's been also very nice to talk to them. But it is a total different ball game of like for me being here like a week in Egypt and actually really seeing how the office is, how the dynamics is, go for dinner with the people and so on. So from now on, my connection with these people in Egypt will be completely different forever, right?
Yeah.
And if we work on projects now in the future, it will be a lot easier to do that. So that's why the physical component is important, and especially very important if you think about remote work. So what we do in my other company is when we onboard remote workers the first time, then they go through basically technical onboarding and all that kind of jazz. But after a certain time, when they really like start becoming like more of a really of a part of the company, then we try to meet them in some way, in some kind of like setup. So of course that's post-COVID, pre-COVID, but but even in COVID, I think you can make things possible, as we have now seen during the summer. Things were a bit easier. You could actually meet. You could have lunch together. You could do something, and then during the winter
Yeah.
it gets a bit more difficult again, and everybody splits up into their own little bubbles.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. Lots of interesting insights. I have like two last questions when it comes to like finding remote workers and also selecting and interviewing them. So do you think like this changes the process of where do we find remote workers and how do we interview them and like make sure they're going to fit in the work environment and the top skills and that people need to have in order for them to qualify for remote work?
Um, Honestly, I think COVID didn't change much there. If I
Mm-hmm.
look through the platforms that we were using before COVID for remote work, it's pretty much the same platforms that we are using now. Like on uh, uh, on the video side and the way how we meet and all that kind of things that we see now, new technologies coming up all the time, platforms, how to work together and so on, but how to have digital conferences and meet with a lot of people and stuff like this. But in terms of like how do you look for remote workers, I think the ecosystem hasn't changed much. Um, but um, but obviously the problem is the same, right? You need to find remote workers. Doesn't matter you're in COVID or before COVID or after COVID. So how do we do that? We do work through basically three ways that are constantly running. One is we are running active campaigns where we are engaged in forums, in online discussion boards, in on websites where our potential workforce is active on, and there we run basically, campaigns that are engaging people into discussions and so on, and then we spread our link on our website where these freelancers could then this is kind of something like a portfolio sign-up link, so they can click and upload their stuff and then introduce themselves to us. That's like point one. Point two is we are working a lot with mouth to mouth. So if we have a worker that where we see like, wow, he or she has the right mindset, this is like really fit to the company, fits in the teams, then we often also ask like, hey, have you worked in the past with somebody who can do this and that? And can you please introduce us? And then we try to onboard these people as well. The third way is that we go through platforms like, for example, Upwork or freelance.com, where we go and then post some our description for the needs that we have, and then people start applying there. We also then have a couple of favorites that we do invite there. Me personally, I really like Upwork on that sense, for the reason that the calculation for the remote worker, if you work, especially if you work on hourly basis, is just pretty fair. They have a software that the remote worker is installing. The software makes a screenshot at random times of their screen. So basically, you as an employer, you don't actually see exactly what they do, but you can kind of like judge, like, okay, is he just checking his email, or is he kind of like working on my thing? And on the other hand, and you have a very nice time control or tracking system, basically, and all these things. So that's why I personally like Upwork, but there are other people like other things as well. And then your second question was about like how to bring these people in, right? How to ramp them up. So our system is that basically every new freelancer that is interested in working with us clicks this link on our website. Then he fills out basically a form, a survey, uploads their portfolios, introduce themselves, and so on. That triggers in our system all project managers to look at that new portfolio entry, this new freelancer, and there is a voting form. So they can basically then vote that freelancer very detailed on whatever skill. So we have within our system, we have like, I don't know, 100 or 150 different skills that we always use. And then according to that skill, every freelancer can be voted. So then they have a certain score in our system, and based on this score, our system, when we write a quotation to a client for a job, for a new movie that we make, then we also have skills that we write there, like for example rendering or animation or lighting or something, and then the system already can basically figure out which remote worker has the highest skill level for that thing, and then recommends people to the project managers. And then we will give, in the beginning, we would give only like small bits to a new freelancer. And through these small bits, these are mainly not so much of a technical test, because technically, usually the people are fine once they, I mean, the rating you can see based on the portfolio, so that's pretty okay usually, but the work ethics is the issue, right? Like, do they adhere to timings? Do they communicate well? How is their English? How do they, what's also their time zone and their time, like, lots of people live at night, right? So then how do they fit with the rest of the team, and so on. So these kind of things will then be kind of like figured out by giving them small jobs or parts of jobs. And when they perform well, then they get a review based on that as well. It's all internally done by our project managers, and then they can grow from there. And until they, most likely after they've done like 2 or 3 jobs with us, they get also big pieces, and then they can become also some of, like, more or less employees. I mean, we have certain people that we have basically, that we constantly work with, and they don't really do a lot of freelance jobs for other companies.
Yeah. That sounds really fantastic. I'm excited to be going through all the notes that I have taken here, and also to redigest and present that to lots of the entrepreneurs and founders, and also to the remote workers to better understand the landscape. So Martin, thank you so much. Do you have anything else to add when it comes to like how do you see like the future, like during and post COVID-19, and how for like those who have to kind of jump into remote work and they might be slightly hesitant or scared? You have any final words for them?
Well, I just hope that we can increase on those physical meetings that we need to have, I believe, in these in the production workflow of whatever you do. So I hope that we get this done at least like once a year. Nobody knows how the future really looks like there. Then if you look really into the future, what I'm looking at is some kind of like more immersed engagement. At the moment, we would probably do something around AR, VR technology there, which is fascinating, and it's interesting to look into like office situations where you can really bring people together working a lot more closely than they do now over like spreadsheets or digital platforms. So that type of, like working with avatars of yourself in a 3D environment through, I don't know, VR glasses or something, it could kind of like bring all of this to a new level. We are not yet there, but we are also engaged right now into researching projects that work basically with EU funding to get more insight in that. So we are trying to bring now our offices with an impact that we have all over the world closer together by adding these VR AR elements, and then see if we can do remote work at least throughout the offices, because in the offices people don't work remote normally if it's not COVID. But to connect these offices more closer together, because they are all around the globe. And once we can do that, we can also do it on remote worker basis. And this is something that I'm really excited on, if you ask me about the future.
Cool. That sounds really fantastic. Immersive engagements. That's a very, very interesting punchline to a very interesting discussion. So thank you so much, Martin, for your time. And, I look forward to connecting with you on another occasion.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
All right.
thank you for the interview.
Pleasure.
I really look forward to read your book.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot.